Well, the importance of Genesis chapters 10 and 11 is that they are the bridge from the beginning of the new world after the flood to the greatest of the biblical patriarchs, Abraham. Now, as brief as these two chapters are, we get a linkage of genealogy between Shem and Abraham, as well as the all-important lines of descent that have now been divided and separated into three distinct groups, each of them with their own destiny. And this destiny for each was contained in the blessings, and for one son, it was actually a curse that Noah pronounced upon his three boys. So let's open our Bibles, and we're going to start reading at Genesis 10, chapter 10, verse 6. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 9. Genesis chapter 10, beginning at verse 6. The sons of Ham were Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush were Sva, Havlah, Savta, Ramah, and Savtcha. The sons of Ramah were Sheva and Dedan. Cush fathered Nimrod, who was the first powerful ruler on earth. He was a mighty hunter before Adonai. This is why people say, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Adonai. His kingdom began with Bavel, Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Asher went out from the land and built Nineveh, the city Rehoboth, Kelach, and Resen between Nineveh and Kelach. That one is the great city. Mitzrayim fathered the Ludim, the Anamim, the Lahavim, the Naphtuhim, the Patrusim, the Kozluchim, from whom came the Philistines, and the Kaphtorim. Canaan fathered Zidon, his firstborn, Het, the Yevusi, the Amori, the Girgashi, the Hivi, the Arki, the Sini, the Arvidi, the Tsamari, and the Hamathi. Afterwards, the families of the Canaanites were dispersed. The border of the the Canaanites was from Sidon as you go towards Gerar to Gaza, and as you go towards Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Tzvoim to Lesha. These were the descendants of Ham according to their families and languages, in their lands and in their nations. Now children were born to Shem, ancestor of all the descendants of Ever and older brother of Yafet. The sons of Shem were Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram were Uz, Hul, Geter, and Mash. Arphaxad fathered Shelach. Shelach fathered Ever. To Ever were born two sons. One was given the name Peleg, but because during his lifetime the earth was divided. His brother's name was Yoktan. Yoktan fathered Almodad, Shelef, Hatzar Mavet, Yerach, Hadoram, Uzal, Dikla, Oval, Avimael, Sheva, Ophir, Havilah, and Yovav. All these were the sons of Yoktan. Now their territory stretched from Mesha as you go towards Sfar to the mountain in the east. These were the descendants of Shem according to their families and languages, in their lands and in their nations. These were the families of the sons of Noah according to their generations in their nations. From these, the nations of the earth were divided up after the flood. I want to make something clear. Shem, Ham, and Yafet were not the only sons of Noah. They were but the sons selected for reasons unknown to be included in the group of Tzaddik, or better, Tzaddikim, righteous ones. Those 8 people who were allowed to live through the flood for the purpose of repopulating the earth. Now, Noah had many sons and daughters over the 600 years of life that he had attained at the moment the flood began. It would be unthinkable to have had so few children in all those centuries. The Bible always operates based on including, and this is an important principle, by the way, so keep this in mind. The Bible always operates on including only those whose names serve a purpose. Even the long genealogies we'll read in the Bible omit names because to the author they serve no useful purpose to add them. And I suspect Noah may have fathered more after the flood. But any of these other children were apparently unimportant to the purpose of the story, so they weren't recorded. Of course, Shem, Ham, and Japheth were the only surviving sons of Noah. All the rest of his family, sons, daughters, granddaughters, grandsons, great-grandkids, too many greats to speak of, they were all deemed wicked by Jehovah, and they were all destroyed, right along with everyone else in the deluge. Well, in verse 6, we followed the line of Ham, the accursed line of Ham. Now, I want to state carefully that I understand that it appears that the curse was only on Ham's son Canaan. However, even the ancient Hebrew sages felt that this is a mistaken notion, and that while Canaan is mentioned prominently, history proved even back then that the entire line of Ham suffered. And we need to pay close attention, very close attention, to these names in the line of Ham because they're going to play a very prominent role in the Bible. Cush, that's Ethiopia. Mitzrayim, that's Egypt. Put is Libya. Canaan, founder of the land of Canaan, who was conquered by Joshua, which eventually became Israel. Those descendants of Canaan form many of the people of the Middle East and of the Orient, some of which are often mistakenly called Arabs. Arabs are of the line of Shem. They're not of the line of Ham. Now, we are told that Cush was the father of the infamous Nimrod. Now, it might come as a surprise to you that Nimrod was a black man. All right, this is not conjecture. Many figurines and reliefs and etchings of Nimrod have been found going back thousands of years, and they all confirm his black features and black skin, and it is perfectly logical that Nimrod should be a black man because in the Bible, whenever you see people called Cushites, that is, people descended from Cush, you could, for your own frame of reference, call them Ethiopians. Generically speaking, a race of black people. Further, it's ancient Jewish tradition that Ham himself was a black man. And I want to make this statement so as I'm not misunderstood. Look, the way that race in the West is thought of is simply not how the ancients thought of it. See, we see race today as a very touchy subject because of a long history of prejudice and slavery, or thinking in terms of racial superiority with the primary distinguishing characteristic being skin color. Lord knows the West has been so terribly guilty of discrimination based on nothing other than the color of one's skin. However, that is the furthest thing of how race is dealt with in the Bible, and discrimination based on skin color just plays no role in the Scriptures. Now, nationality, tribal affiliation, that's a whole other issue, because some tribes and nationalities were historical enemies of other tribes and nationalities. But skin color and physical features simply played no role in it. Now, we should also not just mention Nimrod's name and then just quickly move on. See, we will talk more about him after we read the next chapter. But suffice to say for now that ancient Assyrian tablets found in large quantities not only mention Nimrod, they confirm the title for him that we find in Genesis 10, verse 9, Mighty Hunter. But as the Assyrian tablets explain, that's not because he was good at killing deer and fowl and rabbits and wild boars. This expression means a hunter of humans. He was a warrior. And being a fierce warrior, he became the very first empire builder and a world tyrant. Think about what this means. See, Nimrod is said to be the first to use weaponry and to create plans for humans to kill other humans in mass for whatever their agenda. War started somewhere. There was a first war. And according to the Bible, that somewhere was someone, Nimrod. And that first empire that was built was Bavel, or Babel, the most ancient Babylon, what scholars call the old Babylonian Empire, not the later one built by Nebuchadnezzar, which came many centuries after Nimrod. Now, during Nimrod's day, Babylon, was located in the land of Shinar, an area a little bit west from where Abraham would come in modern-day Iraq. Nimrod is credited with being the builder of Bavel, Babylon, along with 3 other major cities in that area. Next, we're told, if you were paying attention as you were reading your Bible, we're told that Asher went forth. This person, Asher, pops up all of a sudden, and that he built Nineveh, the fabulous city at the heart of Assyria. And like in Babylon, that Asher fellow built 3 more great cities in Assyria. Who's Asher? Asher is just the Assyrian name for Nimrod. Nimrod being a Babylonian name. So, verse 11 is speaking about the same man, just using a different language, and that man was Nimrod. Now, I want to give you a little insight about biblical names. Very often you'll see the same person with as many as 3 or 4 different names, depending on which nation that person was residing in, and what era the biblical account was actually written down versus when the recorded event actually happened, and which culture was speaking of him. Because just like today, where Rick or Ricky is an American nickname, Richard is a more formal English title, Ricardo is Spanish, and Ricardo is Brazilian. But they're all speaking of the same name. The same thing happens concerning nations, regions, cities. The names change over the years as cultures and languages change, still referring to the same person or same place. Now in verse 13, we're told something that has great impact on our current events. Mitzrayim, son of Ham, the line cursed by God. Mitzrayim fathered a people called the Kazluchim. From Kazluchim descended the dreaded Philistines. And we need to remember that the modern word for Philistines is Palestine. The Palestinians of today claim to be descendants of the Philistines who are descended from Ham. In fact, that's not entirely true at all. Indeed, some Philistine residents might be, but the bulk of the Palestinians who we see fighting the Jews every night on TV are Arabs from various areas of the Middle East who came as immigrants to the Holy Land over the last 7,500 years, seeking work on Jewish farms and factories. Arabs are not of the line of Ham. They're from the line of Shem, just like the Israelites are. That said, the fact is that many of these people have made a conscious decision out of their hatred for Israel to identify with the Philistines, because the Philistines were Israel's arch enemy in the Bible area. But they've unwittingly created an enormous problem for themselves. they become an enemy of Israel. And on a physical level, they have made a big problem so that a person can become a Philistine by identifying with the Philistines. They've not become Jews. Many Philistine or Palestinian Arabs have given up their heritage from the line of good, Shem, to join the cursed line. They, as have most Arabs, also given up on the Semite God, Jehovah, for a false god, Allah. They're going to be judged for it. We need to pray for them. We need to wake them up to this fact before it's too late. Anyway, we see a list of tribes spawned by Canaan in verses 15 through 18. And later on, during the Exodus from Egypt, you're going to see many of these names reappear as enemies of the Israelites. You're going to try, by the way, to keep them out of the promised land. Well, in verse 21, we now come to the blessed line of Shem, the line of good. And I want to be clear. As I speak of the line of good and of the line of evil, that doesn't mean that all people in one line turn out good and all the people from the other line turn out evil. By no means are all people who come from Ham destined to be wicked, and all people who come from Shem destined to be godly. Now, notice we come across the name Asher as a son of Shem. This is not the Asher who built Nineveh. This Asher, that Asher, remember, was just a Syrian name for Nimrod. This is another person named Asher. I want to sum up the most important aspect of the verses spelling out the line of Shem. You will notice that Shem is referred to as the father or the ancestor of the children or descendants of Eber or Eber. This is key to Hebrew history because from the line of Eber would come another of God's very important divisions between Peleg and Yoktan. Dividing, selecting, electing. I want you to watch for this because this is a major thing that points to a way that God works his will throughout the Bible and for that matter in our own lives. Peleg and Yoktan were brothers. They were sons of Eber. And interestingly, Peleg means division. Because from the line of Peleg came Abraham, from whom God's plan to rescue all mankind, to restore fallen mankind to himself, was going to come. Let's move on to Genesis chapter 11. Now in chapter 10, let's go ahead and let's stop and read it now. Let's go ahead and read chapter 11 right now. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's chapter 10. Try it again. It's page 10. Chapter 11 on page 10, starting at verse 1. The whole earth used the same language, the same words. It came about that as they traveled from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they lived there, and they said to one another, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them in the fire." So they had bricks for building stone and clay for mortar. And then they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city with a tower that has at its top reaching up into heaven so that we can make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over all the earth." And Adonai came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. And Adonai said, "Look, the people are united. They all have a single language. See what they're starting to do? At this rate, nothing they set out to accomplish will be impossible for them. Come, let's go down and confuse their language so they won't understand each other's speech." So from there, Adonai scattered them all over the earth. They stopped building the city. For this reason, it is called Bavel, confusion. Because there, Adonai confused the language of the whole earth, and from there, Adonai scattered them all over the earth. Here's the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old when he fathered Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. After Arpachshad was born, Shem lived another 500 years, and he had sons and daughters. Arpachshad lived 35 years and fathered Shelach. After Shelach was born, Arpachshad lived another 403 years. He had sons and daughters. Shalach lived 30 years and fathered Eber. And after Eber was born, Shalach lived another 403 years, and he had sons and daughters. Eber lived 34 years and fathered Peleg. And after Peleg was born, Eber lived 430 years and had sons and daughters. Peleg lived 30 years and fathered Reu. Reu was born. Peleg lived another 209 years and had sons and daughters. Reu lived 32 years and fathered Serug. And after Serug was born, Reu lived another 207 years and had sons and daughters. Serug lived 30 years and fathered Nahor. After Nahor was born, Serug lived another 200 years and had sons and daughters. Nahor lived 29 years and fathered Terach. And after Terach was born, Nahor lived another 119 years and had sons and daughters. Now Terach lived 70 years, and he fathered Avram, Nahor, and Haran. Here's the genealogy of Terach. Terach fathered Avram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died before his father Terach in the land where he was born, in the Ur of the Kasdim. Then Avram and Nahor took wives for themselves, and the name of Avram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran. He was the father of Milcah and of Iscah. Sarai was barren. She had no child. Terach took his son Avram, his son Haran's son Lot, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Avram's wife, and they left Ur of the Kasdim to go to the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they stayed there. Terach lived 205 years, and he died in Haran. In chapter 10, we had this expansive summary of the genealogical history of the earth's nations. In chapter 11, now we step back, and we began by examining Nimrod and discovering why the earth's people spread out so rapidly and so thoroughly. We're told that up to that time, a time of Nimrod, every person in the whole world spoke the same language. Now, apparently, people were dispersing at a very measured rate, and they stayed quite linked to a common language because they didn't separate themselves from each other. That is kind of expanded like urban sprawl. Now, notice also which direction they expanded. East. There's that east word again, a word of importance for us. And here it has the greatest of meaning. Notice that the wording says that they, meaning the bulk of Noah's descendants, came from the east to Shinar, rather than saying they moved to the east. Now, it's a little bit confusing because Shinar is south and east from where they came. Shinar is in modern-day Iraq, near the Persian Gulf, an area dominated by the city of Basra. Shinar and Sumer are the same place. They're just different languages. Here's why the reference to moving from the east. By going east from where God had placed them, they in essence moved away from God. Now, we shouldn't necessarily think of what they did by moving as evil. After all, they were pretty much accomplishing what God had instructed, to repopulate the planet. Rather, by the biblical designation that they were going away from east, it was symbolic that they wanted to gain independence from God. They wanted to put distance between themselves and God. A lot like some of us who couldn't wait to reach the age of majority so we could put a little distance between us and the authority of our parents. Now, did Nimrod found the city of Babel, which we now call Babylon, in the sense that it was he who planted a stake in the ground and said, okay, let's build it here? Probably not. He likely took over rulership at some point in a city's early development, pretty common practice. And he just took it to another level. And in time, Babel became a huge city with the smallest estimates being a mile square inside of its walls, and larger estimates at almost 5 times that size. And of course, there's that tower, the Tower of Babel. Now, technically, the tower was a ziggurat, kind of a step pyramid. Several ancient ziggurats have been discovered in modern-day Iran and Iraq. And this particular ziggurat was built for two stated purposes. A, to reach up to heaven so that they could make a name for themselves. And B, to make sure that they weren't scattered. Bottom line, rebellion on an enormous scale. And as we saw in the last couple of weeks, the word Shem means name. And the word Shem is used here when it refers to Nimrod's followers who want to make a name for themselves. But recall that the word name isn't referring to like Bob or Elizabeth or Fred. This Hebrew word Shem would be better translated as reputation because it carries with it this sense of power and authority. For instance, Nimrod means mighty hunter. Mighty hunter was his reputation. So they built a tower up to the heavens to make a reputation of having power and authority in themselves. And the reason they wanted that reputation was to show God they were not going to bow down to him. They were not going to be obedient to him. They were not going to scatter, as it was fully understood they were supposed to do. Further, anyone planning to be a dictator, as was Nimrod, has to demonstrate that he is all-powerful so the people will submit to him. That was very much a part of what Nimrod was doing. Now, it's apparent from the wording that even from the days of Noah, humanity was to scatter, to disperse, to repopulate the whole world. Those were God's instructions. Those orders hadn't been lost or forgotten. They were just ignored. But now, at Nimrod's leadership, they set out to openly defy God's orders to disperse, as it says in verse 4. They built that tower so that we not be scattered over all the earth. The idea in these early Babylonian brains was this: God lives in heaven, no big deal. We humans, with our wonderful intelligence, we can invent a way to build a tower right up to heaven so that we can live up there too if we wish. And when we get there, we're going to tell God we like all the power and knowledge and wealth and comforts we've attained by staying together, by not scattering. And that's just the way we're going to keep it. And you know what, God? There's not a thing you can do about it. And by the way, when everybody hears about us, we'll really make a reputation for ourselves and nobody would ever want to come against us. In fact, they'll all want to join us. I mean, is this far from where we stand today as humankind? Isn't man currently saying, God, your ways are old and obsolete? We've amassed such superior knowledge that we can not only solve our own problems, we can do it better than you can. In fact, you and those backwards people who stay stuck to you and your ways are just a hindrance to where mankind needs to go. We don't need your help. We don't need your direction. We don't need your silly, outdated moral directives. We can make our own as we need them, relevant for each situation. Life, we can produce life. We can manufacture it to our specifications. Marriage, only between a male and a female, great for times long past, not for us. What Nimrod did is nothing different from what our secular humanistic culture is leading us to do today. Rebellion, pure and simple. And in verse 5, we come to one of those figurative expressions in that God came down to look at the tower. God certainly didn't have to move to know what was happening. But, and I really love this, God put down this rebellion in an absolutely brilliant stroke. He just gave everybody different languages. Try putting together a team or building anything when nobody speaks anybody else's language. By the way, paleolinguists, that is, scientists who research the history of language, have come to the fairly recent conclusion that all language sprang from one source. They're working hard to discover which one and exactly from where. I mean, talk about a waste of time now. Just come back and read this chapter. Anyway, in verse 6, when we look at the Hebrew, it gives us some interesting insight. It says that what God saw when he looked upon these people was what? What did he see? Unity. He saw unification. They were united. They had a single language. They all spoke as one. In Hebrew, it says they were echad, which is an attribute attached to God himself. That is, the people were organically connected. They were inseparable. And God didn't like this. But what's so bad about a community of people being united? All for one for all. I mean, isn't this the cry from every pulpit in every church in our land? Unity! We need unity! You see, unity, in the sense mankind often defines it, is a false doctrine. Here in Bavel, the people had a leader, they had a vision, they had a purpose they thought was good, and so since they all thought it together, and they all wanted it, this is unity. Yet when we examine the Scriptures, we don't see God unifying. We see God dividing and electing and separating. In fact, later, when we see Israel wind up in Egypt, and then when we study the laws of Leviticus, we're going to see Jehovah constantly telling the people to do what? Separate themselves from the unclean and unholy people. Separate the pure from the impure things concerning food, animals, behavior. Separation was his intention for Nimrod and his followers. See, unity in itself isn't a bad thing. The key is what or who the unifying agent is. Intellectual consensus and political compromise, that's man's kind of unity. It is the kind that we see right now throughout Christendom and the world. It's humans holding hands saying, whoa, we're one. God's type of unity is unity in him. It's each individual holding Christ's hand. And like the hub of a spoked wheel, Christ is the point of unity. It has nothing to do with consensus. It's not compromise. It's not even majority rules. What is also fascinating is that we get a wonderful demonstration of this principle in the form of the opposite thing happening thousands of years later. Now, remember our principle of opposites. Everything in our universe has an opposite, or for you scientists, a reverse corollary. Here's the story, or rather, here in the story of the Tower of Babel, God is once again demonstrating how he will divide and separate that which man wants to unify. And the dividing mechanism he used on this particular occasion was language. In the book of Acts, however, we see man being unified in God's way at the day of Pentecost. In effect, unifying that which he had divided and separated 2,000 years earlier. Open your Bibles to the book of Acts, chapter 2. Book of Acts, chapter 2. Now, if you have a complete Jewish Bible, this will be on page 1361. Book of Acts, chapter 2. The festival of Shavuot had arrived, and the believers all gathered together in one place. Suddenly, there came a sound from the sky like the roar of a violent wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. And then they saw what looked like tongues of fire, which separated and came to rest on each one of them. They were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to talk in different languages as the Spirit enabled them to speak. Now, there were staying in Jerusalem religious Jews from every nation under heaven. And when they heard this sound, a crowd gathered, and they were confused, because each one heard the believers speaking in his own language. And they were totally amazed. And they asked, "How's this possible? Aren't all these people who are speaking from the Galilee? How is it that we hear them speaking in our native languages? We are Parthians and Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judah, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, Jews by birth and proselytes, Jews from Crete, from Arabia. How is it that we hear them speaking in our own languages about the great things God has done?" Amazed and confused, they all went on asking each other, "What can this mean?" But others made fun of them and said, "They just had too much wine." And then Peter stood up with the 11 and raised his voice to address them. "You, Judeans, all of you staying here in Jerusalem, let me tell you what this means, and listen carefully to me. These people aren't drunk, as you suppose. It's only 9 a.m. No, this is what was spoken about through the prophet Joel. Adonai says, "In the last days, I'll pour out my Spirit upon everyone. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my slaves, both men and women, will I pour out my Spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. I will perform miracles in the sky above, signs on the earth below, blood, fire, thick smoke. The sun will become dark, and the moon blood, before the great and fearful day of Adonai comes. And then whoever calls on the name of Adonai will be saved." I hope you see this fascinating connection between Pentecost and the Tower of Babel. At the tower, God broke up man's type of unity by giving them different language so they couldn't communicate, so that man's kind of unity was undone and limited. The human spirit was what was driving mankind at the Tower of Babel, and the human spirit was what was defining unity. Now at Pentecost, Shavuot, God puts the Holy Spirit into man and unifies them by means of God's Spirit, not by means of compromise and consensus. The unity was not a physical type of unity. It was a spiritual type of unity. God even gives these believing Jews the ability to understand and speak languages they never understood or spoke before. The exact opposite of what happened at the Tower of Babel when he gave them each languages that they couldn't understand each other. Let's talk about Nimrod again. Nimrod was a real, literal man, but he also represented a type. He is the first of a type of man who wanted to rule the world. And he represented all the attributes of he who will become the last man who wants to rule the world, the Antichrist. Nimrod is the man of sin who was fully possessed by Satan, by the complete, absolute agreement of his own evil inclination. So it will be for many who come after Nimrod. They will be of the same type as Nimrod. Pharaoh, Antiochus Epiphanes, Nero, Hitler, just to name a few, culminating in the lawless one, the man of sin, the beast called the Antichrist. And of course, the man of sin is to oppose the man who is the exact opposite of him, Yeshua, Jesus the Christ, who is fully possessed and is one with Jehovah. Nimrod of the accursed line of Ham, son of Cush, is credited with being the first empire builder in history. He is the first to want to dominate not just the animals, but mankind. He is the first to build a walled city. This is a clue as to why he was thought to be the inventor of warfare. I mean, there's only one reason to build a wall around where you live: self-protection. And if you were the first to think of the idea, can you imagine how you could go out and raid and conquer others and then retreat to the safety behind the wall so that others couldn't do the same thing to you? Nimrod married Semiramis. And after he died, his wife declared him to be God. Further, as the earthly wife of God, she made herself the queen of heaven. They had a son and named him Tammuz. Tammuz was considered to be the rebirth or the reincarnation of his father, Nimrod. So, now we have a man-god ruler, Tammuz, whose essence was his father, Nimrod. The formulation of God the Father, Queen of Heaven Mother, and a son whose essence was the rebirth of the Father became the basis for all future false religions. Those religions that God calls Mystery Babylon religions, they all have their starting point with Nimrod. And ever since that day, both Nimrod and Semiramis, now deified as a god and goddess, they've appeared by different names. Names reflecting the language and the culture that adopted them. Semiramis, as the mother of all mothers, was therefore the fertility goddess. So, in Egypt, her name was Isis. In India, Indrani. In Asia, Sybil. Later, particularly in the area of the Holy Land, she will be called Ashtaroth. Her oldest known name is Astarte. Now, as for Nimrod, his god image became known as the biblical Baal and as the godman Ninus, who built Nineveh. Later, Nimrod would also be known as Marduk and then Molech. Now, I'm not showing you all this so that you can see the tangle of evil that shows up in our scriptures from beginning to end and what it is that makes up these so-called Mystery Babylon religions, at least foundationally, and where it all came from. And how this prophetic curse of the line of Ham by Noah is playing out. You know, it could well be that the Antichrist will be from the line of Ham. Now, nothing says that in the Bible, but there's implications. Now, interestingly, the name of the city that Nimrod first built, Bavel, had in more ancient times a different meaning than it does now. Notice the spelling of Bavel, B-A-V-E-L. L indicates the word God, the highest God, actually. Originally, Bavel meant the city of God. Eventually, its meaning got changed to reflect what happened there. And Bavel was changed to mean confusion. In the end, as a result of the confusion of languages, the city of Bavel, Babylon, stopped its expansion. The people moved out. Now, at a much faster pace, they began to repopulate far-flung places in the world. Isn't it curious how at that point in man's history, God judged humanity by confusing human language and forced us to disperse? But then at Pentecost, thousands of years later, God blessed humanity through the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, when God's truth could be understood by everyone of every language. And as marvelous was that event, it would point to yet another time in the future when the people of God and all the nations of the world would come back from their dispersion to unite in one spirit under one present and future King, Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus Christ. We call this united kingdom of God the millennial kingdom. But wouldn't you just know that, like everything else Satan has planned, he is diligently working towards a counterfeit. of this united world kingdom, his own form of a one-world unity government. We today are in that generation that is actively reincarnating what Nimrod tried to do, to bind the world into one people, echad, under one rule and one ruler, a human. And large segments of the church are blindly leading the way, preaching tolerance, world harmony, peace at any price, the end of God's Torah commandments, such that instead we should trust the goodness of our hearts to lead us. From verse 10 to the end of this chapter, the lineage of Shem, beginning with him and taking us all the way to Abraham, is recounted. We're also given some good basic information about Abraham and his family. For instance, his father was Terah, and Abraham had two brothers, at least two, and their names were Nahor and Haran. Haran had a son named Lot. But Haran died, and we see that Abraham married a woman named Sarai. We later find out she was the daughter of another of his father's wives. Sarai was Abraham's half-sister. And we're told that for some reason Sarai couldn't seem to have children. A curious thing, often overlooked, is told in verse 31. It seems that it was initially Terah, not Abraham, who first got the idea to take his family and move to the land of Canaan. And when Terah made that decision, he and his family were living in the city of Ur of the Chaldees. The Chaldees were an ancient culture of that area. Sumer was the region's name. Ur was essentially the capital city. It was also a very wicked place. In fact, it was the cultural center for the worship of the moon god, Herki, later known as Sin, and who today is called Allah. Interestingly, for some reason, when Terah left Ur, instead of heading southwest to his destination in Canaan, he went northwest to Mesopotamia. And when they arrived at a certain city, they decided to stay there instead of continuing on to Canaan. Why that decision was made, we're not told. But it was there that Abraham's brother Haran died, and the city was named after him sometime later. And by the way, technically at this time, Abraham wasn't yet called Abraham. He was called Abram, or in Hebrew, Avram, which meant exalted father. It was going to be several more years before God changed his name from Avram to Abraham, which meant father of many. And we'll continue with the story of Abraham next week.